On tonight's Partners for Democracy special event, Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff, Kim Allen, co-founder of the lead protection organization, voter protection organization in Georgia, Power the Vote, Georgia State Representative Stacy Evans and Saira Draper, and Emory University political science professor Andra Gillespie. They join us this evening for an in-depth look at target state Georgia, one of the 7 states deemed most critical in determining who our next president will be. And good evening, I'm Jim Trenger with Partners for Democracy, and thank you for joining us this evening. We've already taken in-depth, deep dive looks at Nevada and Arizona, North Carolina and Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin, and those special events have been archived and are available on our website. And this event is also being recorded and will be made available on the site as well. A quick note, our audience tonight is muted, but you can submit questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. And you'll be asked to consider supporting Power the Vote, the organization credited with protecting the Georgia vote in 2020, which led in part to Senator Ossoff's victory. You can do that through our website. We'll also be putting the link in the chat. And we begin with Senator Ossoff. Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
A pleasure, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your commitment to our democracy.
Well, thank you. You know, Senator, many of us look back at Joe Biden's win in Georgia in 2020, the 2 Senate runoff elections won by you and Raphael Warnock, Senator Warnock's reelection in 2022. It gave us a lot of us the impression that Georgia was turning blue, yet, you know, polls over the past few months consistently showed Donald Trump ahead, narrowly in some polls, but ahead. And although we don't know what other events, for instance, today's New York jury verdict against the former president might affect voter opinions. But, you know, Senator, you travel the state routinely. What are you seeing and hearing from voters in Georgia?
Well, thank you again for having me. And I wouldn't read too much into polling at this point or at all. I think polling in this environment is largely guesswork, and the methodology has not kept up with the realities of how we should understand public opinion. I expect Georgia to be very close, very competitive. And, you know, as I travel the state, it's not the daily partisan drama that most voters raise with me. It's questions about whether their mail is going to get delivered on time. We have a huge problem with the U.S. Postal Service here in Georgia right now. And at one point, a couple of weeks ago, about 36% on-time delivery rate. That means that prescriptions aren't reaching folks in the mail. It means that bills aren't getting paid. It means that companies aren't receiving supplies and getting products to market. And crucially, it means that ballots may not be reaching election offices in time to be counted, where Georgia passed a new voter suppression law based upon the conspiracy theories and lies of the Trump faction in the Republican Party, which made voting by mail much more arduous for eligible voters. I kid you not, Jim, as I walk through the airport in Atlanta, as I travel the state, vastly more people raise issues with the post office with me than anything that you might expect to lead cable news or to dominate on social media. Beyond those kinds of issues, one of the things that's being felt powerfully across Georgia is the combination of the infrastructure and manufacturing policies that we enacted in the 117th Congress. And it's worth remembering that without those 2 victories in Georgia, and those 2 victories in Georgia depended upon a robust voter protection effort, we would not have been able to enact a legislative agenda. We had a 50-50 Senate. We relied upon the vice president's tie-breaking vote in order to pass significant legislation, which is now attracting billions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs to the state in clean energy, solar manufacturing, battery production, electric vehicle manufacturing. Today, I was at the Kia plant in West Point, Georgia, where they are rolling the first Kia-produced electric vehicles made in America off the line right here in Georgia. And they're doing that because of the Made in America manufacturing policies that we passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're undertaking an expansion of broadband internet access in Georgia that's unlike anything we've seen since rural electrification in the 1930s. We're getting lead pipes out of drinking water systems. We're making coastal evacuation routes and causeways and dunes and storm surge barriers more resilient. We're upgrading every seaport and airport in the state. We're upgrading surface transportation and transit infrastructure. It's the biggest infrastructure program since the Eisenhower administration, and it's joining with the powerful manufacturing incentives that we passed to support really rapid economic development, wealth creation, and job creation in Georgia. None of it would have happened if we hadn't won those 2 Senate races, and we wouldn't have won those 2 Senate races without robust voter protection and without robust voting rights efforts, which is why I thank all of you for the investments that you're making in those efforts in Georgia and nationwide.
Senator, I do want to talk about voter protection and SB 202, which came out after your election. But all those improvements and positive aspects of the Biden administration and what was made possible by the control of the Senate, is that message getting out to voters, or more work needs to be done on that?
Well, always more work to be done, but yes, there's broad recognition that these infrastructure and manufacturing policies are benefiting Georgia. By a recent study, Georgia is the beneficiary of more private sector investment as a result of the manufacturing policies in the IRA than any other state in the country. And I think it's important. I know that there's always trepidation, anxiety in an election year, particularly given the stakes here, where we have a challenger who poses a clear and present danger to the rule of law and to the Constitution, who is, credibly challenging, and it'll be very close in Georgia. But we shouldn't lose confidence in the record of achievement over the last few years. One of the most productive legislative Congresses in many decades, with policies that are upgrading quality of life and public health and establishing new manufacturing capacity in our national security interest and our energy security interest across Georgia and across the nation. We need to make sure that folks are aware of that progress that's being made and have confidence that that's a very clear contrast with the chaos and as clarified today by a unanimous jury ruling in New York, criminal activity represented by the opposition.
Senator, to keep the progress going, we need voters to turn out, but need to have their votes protected as well. If you can talk a little bit about that and how that helped you in 2020 and the importance of moving ahead in 2024 with that.
Well, without robust voter protection in Georgia in 2020 and in the 2021 runoff, I think that the result likely would have been different in both the presidential and the Senate runoffs. And something I want everyone to bear in mind, and why the need remains so urgent in Georgia. One thing that I think is most disturbing is how Georgia law now enables these mass challenges, frivolous challenges to voters' eligibility in our state. From 2020 through the 2022 election, in those 3 big elections, the general, the runoff, and then the 22 general, hundreds of thousands of voters in Georgia had their eligibility to vote challenged by fringe right-wing groups exploiting our state's election laws. I don't think there's anything more cynical than saying to yourself, you know what we're going to do is we're going to go out there and we're going to try to strip from our neighbors, our community members, our fellow Georgians, their right to vote on the basis of these mass frivolous challenges. And it's not just, Jim, that this puts the franchise at risk for the individuals whose eligibility to vote is being challenged. Again, almost all of it frivolous and without merit and partisan targeted. It's also that this overwhelms local election offices with the task saturation associated with having to respond to all those challenges. So that instead of preparing for the orderly execution of the election, instead of making sure everyone's aware of how and when and where to vote, instead of making the opportunity to vote more widely available, these county election boards are all tied up, going through hundreds of thousands of frivolous partisan voter challenges. This is just another reason why investments in voter protection in Georgia are so essential this year, when I assure you the result in Georgia will be very, very close.
Senators, 159 counties, is that correct?
That's right.
That's a lot of local election boards doing their own battling to get the vote out. So what are you seeing? You're saying you're guaranteeing this is going to be safe. How so? I mean, what's been put in place to
No, I said I'm saying I'm guaranteeing it's going to be very close.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The margin may depend upon robust voter protection and not just voter protection, but voter assistance for voters who are confused about how they can vote, who are confused by the new barriers that have been put between them and the franchise precisely to confuse them and to deter them from participating. What I guarantee is that the result in Georgia is going to be very, very close. And I expect that just as in the general election in 2020, just as in the runoffs in 2021, just as in 2022, when Senator Warnock sued the state, which was trying to prevent weekend voting on the basis that, wait for it, it was Robert E. Lee's birthday, and Senator Warnock won that case in court. Just as in those elections, voter protection, infrastructure, voter protection, litigation are going to be essential to ensuring that the people's voice is represented by the result.
Good. Senator, thank you so much. Appreciate joining us. We know the Senate's going to be hanging by a thread in November again, so it's important. I know you're not running this year, but you've got a lot of colleagues out, and let's just hope they can hold the Senate and take back the House, and continue with the progress that the administration's been making. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and a pleasure to join you. And I see that Representative Evans, Representative-elect, or Representative nearly elect Draper, I don't want to get ahead of myself, Saira. You've been in a confusing place with incumbency. So Representative Draper, who just secured a primary victory again in the district she represented. Forgive me, Saira. Of course, I know that. Are on the call, and Saira and Kim did fantastic work here in 2020 and 2021. Great to see some Georgians on the line. Thank you all for your interest in our state.
Okay, thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Let's go to Kim Allen. Kim, you know Senator Ossoff. You worked with him with the Democratic Party back in 2020. Tell us a little bit about Power the Vote and the mission that you've taken on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim, and thanks for having me tonight. I am one of the co-founders of Power the Vote. Our mission is to fund permanent year-round voter protection staff at state Democratic parties in battleground states to carry forward the work that we did at the Democratic Party of Georgia in 2020.
And so what's going to be happening in Georgia in 2024? Tell us about that.
Great. Yeah, great question. So would love to tell you more about our work. I think I'm going to share my screen because I've got some slides. Voter protection work is pretty dense and meaty, so I love to really dig into it. So maybe I'll just start with a little bit about our origin story. In 2020, myself and my co-founders, including Representative Saira Draper, who's here on this call with us today, we were the leadership of the voter protection team at the Democratic Party of Georgia. And we built a program that DNC Chair Jamie Harrison calls the nationwide model for voter protection programs. Georgia would not have flipped blue without our work, which is not to say that we carried all the water. It took an enormous amount of effort to get Georgia over the line, but our work was a critical piece of that puzzle. So I just want to share a couple of our statistics and big wins from 2020. Our voter protection hotline took 130,000 calls from voters in 7 languages. We helped to defeat challenges to the eligibility of 364,000 voters in 153 counties. And critically, we helped 15,000 voters who needed to fix an issue with their ballots to get their vote counted in the general election. And that work on its own more than exceeded President Biden's margin of victory. And the ramifications of our work are still being felt today. The only reason Trump told Raffensperger that he needed to find those 12,000 votes is because our voter protection program found them first. And so now, as Power of the Vote, we're taking the lessons that we learned in 2020 and carrying them forward through funding year-round permanent voter protection staff. We're making our biggest investments this year in Georgia, and we've also funded voter protection staff this cycle in Arizona, North Carolina, and Texas. So just as a way of introducing you to our work and helping you understand and having context for it, I want to, when we say we fund voter protection work, I want to tell you exactly what it is that we're talking about. This work comes from recognition that it's not enough to register and engage and turn out voters. If they show up to vote at an 8-hour-long line, like we saw at some points in Georgia in 2020, or if they cast a ballot and that ballot is rejected because they failed to bring an ID to the polling place, for example, and then ultimately, all that work to persuade voters of our democratic message and get them to show up to vote is for nothing. And so voter protection comes in and picks up at what we call the last mile of voting and helps to ensure that every voter can vote, that every vote is counted, and that election wins are certified. One question we get a lot is, why are we doing this work through state Democratic parties? Shouldn't democracy work be nonpartisan? And in some ways it is, but the answer to this question might surprise you. Fundamentally, we cannot solve our crisis of democracy without effective state Democratic Party voter protection programs. And here is why. State and county parties have, under state laws, unique roles to play in administering elections. Nationwide, 60% of local election officials are either partisan elected or partisan appointed. And in Georgia, these roles include election board members who run elections at the local level, who vote on things like polling place locations, polling hours, poll worker training, all aspects of election administration. In addition, state and county parties have the authority to appoint certain voter protection roles, including poll watchers who observe inside of polling places and monitors who observe the processing of absentee ballots at an elections office. And so if we don't do this work, the way I think about it, in order for us to save our democracy, we have to be firing on all engines. And state Democratic parties are one of those engines. And if we don't do this work through state parties, there is truly no one else who can do it. And so when we founded Power of the Vote after the 2020 cycle, that was a critical need that we saw that no one else was filling. And so that's why at Power of the Vote, we're working to build voter protection infrastructure within state parties. Another reason why we're doing that is voter protection wins elections. And as just a few examples, voter protection programs made the margins of victory for President Biden in Wisconsin and Georgia in 2020. It made the margin of victory in the attorney general's race in Arizona last year, which has been so critical for keeping an election denier out of that office. It also helped to flip the Pennsylvania House in 2022. And so as we look ahead to November, voter protection, we can predict, is going to play a critical role in winning in battleground states again. And the closer the election is, the more important this work is. So I want to tell you a bit about the work that we're supporting in Georgia this year. We are funding 5 staff at the Democratic Party of Georgia. 3 of these are regional manager staff. We've touched on there are 159 counties in Georgia. You need a lot of folks to really get their hands around how elections are being administered at the local level. And that's really where so much of the important work happens. And so these regional managers are going to be responsible for holding a certain number of counties in their hands, for building relationships with county elections officials, for ensuring that we've got eyes and monitoring on what's happening in elections at the local level. They can help advocate to prevent problems or advocate for pro-voter practices like Sunday voting or increased polling locations. They can also help us be our first line of defense in solving a problem when it comes up. And by having the right relationship, they can pick up the phone to solve a problem instead of us having to file a lawsuit. And so really, this is like the rapid response team. These are the folks who help us us be ready and poised to solve problems as they come up and know that they're happening in the first place. And then we're also funding 2 hotline staff to run the Georgia Voter Protection Hotline. This was such a critical support for voters, and it's going to continue to be this year. It also is one way that we have eyes on what's happening and the issues that are impacting voters so that we can mobilize programmatically to respond to them. And I want to mention, I have also, in a consulting capacity, been working hand in hand with the state party since June of last year to help organize the program and give it some strategic direction, and then helping to support the staff as they've been coming in. So I've been integrally involved with the work that's going on in Georgia this year. So, okay, so why Georgia and why this year? Well, it's been our experience and something that we credit from our work in 2020. One of the reasons why we were so effective in 2020 is because we had a legacy of knowledge and relationships from the prior election cycle, because Georgia was the first state party to have a year-round permanent voter protection staff. And so it's one of our ideas that sustained year-round voter protection work is critical to winning in Georgia, not this year alone, but in every single year. Georgia is the focal point for so much voter suppression and election subversion activity, and it's also a critical part of the path to 270, and voter protection is such an important piece of how we can win in Georgia. And so we're not only, of course, working towards winning this year at the presidential level and for the races that are on the ballot this year, but we're also working to build permanent voter protection infrastructure that looks ahead and supports Democratic wins in 2026, when Senator Ossoff will be on the ballot, and beyond. So I want to share just a couple of big impacts from our work this year. One is around challenges to voter eligibility, and another is election certification. And I'm only sharing 2 because we don't have unlimited time, but for anyone who is interested in a deeper dive into the work that we're doing, please reach out. I'd be delighted to talk with you more. I really geek out about this stuff, so happy to take a much deeper dive when I have more time. So first, let's focus in on the issue of challenges to voter eligibility. So Republicans in 2022 challenged 100,000 voters statewide, and in 2020, when we were at the program, challenged 364,000 voters statewide. The concern here is that these challenges can be filed by any registered voter against any other voter in the county. And so just 6 Republicans filed challenges in 2022 to about 100,000 voters. And they've indicated that they plan to file many more challenges this year. And the truth of it is that Republicans are weaponizing these voter challenges to bypass protections for voters under federal law, or at least that's what they're hoping to do. And reporting by well-respected outlets have indicated that these are discriminatory challenges that are disproportionately targeted to Democratic voters, and they're also often explicitly targeting voters who are very vulnerable, including people who are unhoused. As I said, they've signaled that they're going to be escalating tactics ahead of November this year. So why are we so concerned about these challenges? Well, these are, first of all, a real burden to elections offices. In Forsyth County, which is one of the 5 counties that's experienced the most challenges and is in Metro Atlanta, about 20% of the registered voters have been challenged in the county. So that's like 1 in 5 voters, which is really extraordinary. And that's placed an enormous burden on these elections offices to be assessing and responding to these challenges as they're filed. And that pulls them away from other important work that these elections offices need to do. In addition, it takes a toll on the individual voters who've been challenged. If a challenge is upheld, the voter can be removed from the voting rolls entirely and lose their right to vote, just like that. And even if a voter isn't removed, they may be called into a hearing to defend their right to vote, which for many voters is a significant burden and a major investment of time, or they may not even be able to make it to that kind of a hearing at all. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, Governor Kemp just signed a new law a few weeks ago that is designed to make it even harder or even easier for Republicans to successfully challenge voters. And so what we're seeing is that county elections officials are working to reconcile these changes in the law and the permissive challenge statutes with the protections that are afforded under federal law. And there are essentially no state election board rules or Secretary of State guidance that govern and that help to ensure uniformity in how challenges are being decided statewide. And so really we're seeing that folks need and want support to understand how to navigate these challenges in a way that both safeguards voters' fundamental right to vote and is also administratively feasible for the county. And so, like, that's the really difficult news. But the good news is that we've been here before. We've defeated mass challenges in prior election cycles. And with the right kinds of support and with the right kind of mobilizing effort, we can do it again. So here is how the state party is fighting back with our support. There's a mixture here of both preventative and responsive strategies that are designed to give a holistic, view of how we respond here. In terms of preventative strategies, we're working to train county board of election members on the law so that they can understand how to approach these challenges and be sensitized to the kinds of issues that tend to come up in these challenges and understand how to respond. In addition, we've phone banked and reached out to voters who have moved across county lines within Georgia and who need help updating their voter registration. And this is really important because these are the voters that are at the top of the list to be challenged. And we don't want these voters to be removed from the voting list when they're still a Georgia resident. We want them to be registered to vote in their county of residence. And so we've called these voters and helped them update their voter registration. And of course, as people continue to change their registration, we anticipate we'll be doing this on a proactive basis more than once as we head into the fall before the voter registration deadline. In addition, we have a mix of responsive strategies that address challenges as they're filed. We're supporting Board of Election members in understanding the nature of the challenge that's been filed, the evidence and support, and the very best arguments for why these challenges don't meet the legal standards under Georgia law and/or must be rejected under federal law. And then we're also poised to help voters who are impacted re-register so that they don't lose their right to vote ahead of November. And in this regard, we've had one really amazing win. In Bibb County, Republicans filed one of the very first mass challenges we've seen outside of the metro Atlanta area since 2020. And we mobilized a response there. We supported the Board of Election members in understanding the challenge and in understanding the law that goes around the challenge, and helped them and supported them. And although we only have 2 Democratic members in Bibb County, they successfully worked with the county attorney and with the other Board of Election members, and nearly the vast majority of the challenges were ultimately rejected unanimously with the vote of Republican members and the nonpartisan member of the board. And so we have a good framework and a good model for how to respond to these challenges as they're filed, and we're equipped to help support these Board of Election members as they address these issues. But I will say Republicans are not deterred. They've said that there's more to come on this. They're not backing down. And so we're geared up and ready for what we expect is going to be a wave of challenges that's filed over the next several months. The second issue that I want to highlight as an impact of the work that we're funding in Georgia is around election certification. Republicans are attempting to lay the groundwork to refuse to certify the November election results, and we're already seeing this movement happening. I want to emphasize this was not a major issue in 2020, and it hasn't been in prior cycles. And so really, this is a new kind of thing that's evolving among Republican Board of Election members. In November of 2023, we saw the first efforts by Republicans to refuse to certify. They did that in 3 major metro Atlanta counties, Spalding, Cobb, and DeKalb. And then in March, for the presidential preference primary, we also saw Republicans refuse to certify in Fulton and Gwinnett counties, also 2 major metro Atlanta counties. And so here is how the state party is fighting back with our support. We're funding staff, these regional managers who are mobilizing volunteers to monitor the boards of elections, to look for these kinds of election subversion trends that we're concerned about, and to help us be equipped to respond to these issues as they come up. And I can't emphasize just how important these staff are for not only this piece of the work, but for everything else that we're doing to help to fight for democracy at the county level in Georgia. I also, in my consulting capacity, brought learnings from other states, like Arizona, which had election subversion efforts in 2022, and that helped to inform strategy around election certification issues. And then the state party has sent some pretty excellent legal letters to these county boards as Republicans have voted against certification. And these letters have reminded them that under Georgia law, election certification is a non-discretionary legal duty. And not only that, but there are consequences if you refuse to certify, including criminal penalties under Georgia law. And Republicans have been taken a bit aback by this. I think they're surprised to find that they have this duty and that they could be subjected to criminal penalties for refusing to certify. But very interestingly, they claim that they don't have these duties, but after we've sent these letters in each of the subsequent elections, the March presidential primary, and last week we just had the May 21st state primary, in every instance, each of these boards of elections has unanimously certified the election results, including with the vote of the Republican members, except in Fulton, where a Republican member abstained rather than voting against certification. And so, we are really pleased to see this, in part because it is a recognition and an acknowledgement that this duty exists, but we see that the threat is not over. They are signaling that they're looking for new ways to subvert elections. And so we expect that certification is going to be a big fight, and we do see movement towards this effort in November. And so we're really proud to support the state party's work to monitor elections, to monitor these trends as Republicans are making moves around subverting elections and preparing, and as we're all preparing to fight back against these anti-democracy efforts. So here's kind of the bottom line for folks as I wrap up here. There is so much that we can do. I came away from the 2020 election totally wowed by the power of just average, ordinary people coming together to build a movement for democracy. And I saw how this work made an impact. It made an impact in Georgia. It's made an impact in other states as well. And so I want folks to come away with that sense of empowerment, that there is so much that we can do. I know folks are discouraged about the courts or about gerrymandered legislatures, but this organizing movement that brings people together to support democracy is really quite powerful, and it does win elections. And so I want people to feel empowered to support this work in your own way. The first is to, please, if you would, consider giving to support our work in Georgia, to support this voter protection program, which is really on the front lines of democracy. We have a goal of raising another $75,000 this year, so please consider giving if you're able. But also, I'd like for you to sign up and join this movement for democracy in a volunteer capacity if you have the time. Please sign up for our email list, and I'll drop our website in the chat. There's at the bottom of the first page, you can sign up for our emails. We're going to be sending around voter protection volunteer opportunities. You don't have to live in Georgia or a battleground state to volunteer. There are remote opportunities that you can do from the comfort of your own living room or kitchen table. And I would really encourage you to get involved. I want to tell you, folks, we had this verdict today, and something that I used to get very angry about the news cycle before I started working in voter protection. And for me, doing this work has been such a salve, such an antidote to the kind of negativity or the pessimism about the era that we're in. And so if that resonates with you, please do get involved. Find a way to give back and contribute. And I can promise you, you will love joining this amazing community of like-minded people who are all about taking action and doing something about this world that we're in right now. So that's my pitch to you. And I want to thank you so much for being here and hearing about our work. And I'm going to hand it back to Jim for.
Well, thank you, Kim. And actually, you answered one of the questions from Lois is about how can out-of-staters, rather, in addition to give money, how can they volunteer? So if they go to the Power of the Vote website, you'll see the opportunities there. And also, if you want to contribute, we ask you to strongly consider it. You can go to our website at partners4democracy.com, and you will be taken right to an Act Blue link for Power the Vote, and you can contribute that way. So, Kim, thank you so much. Great work that you're doing, and good luck. I know it's gearing up now that the primaries are over. The challenges will start to come in again. So, we wish you the best. And now I want to go to our two state representatives, Stacy Evans and Saira Draper. Both of them. Let me pull them up. Stacy, how are you doing tonight?
Hi, good. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Good, thank you. And Saira, also good to see you.
Great to see you.
And also we have with us Andra Gillespie, professor of political science at Emory University. Hello, Andra.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you for all being here. We want to talk about the voters in Georgia. And Stacy, describe your district a little bit. And you probably won't, well, you were uncontested in the primary. Tell us about how you campaign for your fall election at the same time, try to get the top of the ticket elected.
Well, thanks again for having me. And yes, my district is considered a safe Democratic district, but I always follow the advice of former Governor Busby here in Georgia, who says you either run unopposed or you run scared. And so we'll still be mounting a campaign, which I think shows commitment to the voters and the fact that they have a choice, even if it's an out of whack district. But also, I really believe and try to emphasize to my constituents in my district, which is an in-town neighborhood, like I said, predominantly Democratic,
It's
very educated.
Suburban, Atlanta, just north of Atlanta, correct?
No, we are in town Atlanta.
You are
when
in
you think
town,
of
okay.
Atlanta, Midtown, the Fox Theater,
Okay,
the High
good.
Museum, that's my area. So very educated, very highly motivated, high information voters. And I try to make sure that folks know if our district turns out big, since it's full of Democratic voters, that's only going to help the top of the ticket too, and remind folks exactly what's on the ballot. So we'll be going out and talking to voters starting after folks get back from their summer vacation, and raising some money in the meantime, both for my district and also Saira and I need some friends in the state legislature. So I know she'll be doing this too, but I call it sharing the blue. I take motivated, excited folks within my district and we write postcards and we raise money and do other things and spread that out to the targeted seats where we know we can pick up a seat in areas that aren't perhaps as solid blue as House District 57 where I live.
Okay, thank you. Saira, let's go to your district, the 90th district. If you could describe it, I guess it's a little bit more diverse than Stacy's, correct?
Perhaps, yes. So I represent the 90th district. It is a proportions of Atlanta and unincorporated DeKalb County. It is the district formerly represented by Stacey Abrams, and then after her, B. Wynn. So it is a very just a legacy of women who have been, protecting the right to vote have come from this district. And I'm very, very proud to follow in their footsteps and doing this work. But yes, it's the highest, it's the most blue district in the state. So we have 180 House districts in the state of Georgia, and this is the bluest of districts. And we also have just incredibly engaged populace, and normally we have the highest voter turnout in the state. And so that's an opportunity because we are so educated and involved in the political process. It's an opportunity, but also as high as our voter turnout is, it could be way higher. I mean, we just had a primary a week ago, and I think the highest voter turnout precinct was at about 30%, which just, it hurts me so much when you think about the cost per voter that we're putting in and the amount of energy that is put into getting voters out for a primary. Now, naturally, when you have these general elections, you're going to see more people head to the polls. But as good as our turnout is, we can do a lot better. And, I think we're going to have a lot of reversed coattails effect in Georgia this year. If they have someone lower on the ticket that people are excited about, it's going to necessarily mean more votes for President Biden at the top of the ticket. So we're going to be working at it from both angles, I think.
Sorry, when we talked last week, I asked how the look of Georgia had changed, if it had changed much since the 2020 elections, and you said quite a bit. Describe, if you can, beyond your state, and I also want to go to Andra at all as well to talk about the new look of Georgia, leaning more blue than it has, correct?
It sure has. I mean, over the last 4 years, we have seen so many people move to Georgia. They're moving here from California and New York and other places, of course. But I think the thing to focus on is these are young people. These are people of color. These are people moving to the cities. These are all going to trend Democratic voters. So we have every reason to believe that the number of net Democratic voters in Georgia has increased since the last election and will continue to trend in that direction as time moves on.
Andra, talk about, if you would, about, I heard you on an interview, I guess last year or so, talking about Georgia is not Alabama, Louisiana. It's got a much different look as far as beyond the white voters, correct?
Yeah, so in the South, race and party are actually highly correlated with one another, and there's racial polarization in voting. So whites tend to vote Republican, blacks tend to vote Democratic, and even though blacks make up the largest concentration of voters in the South, we're still talking about a ceiling of 30 to 35%. Georgia's at about 30% African American, and so if most whites are voting Republican and most blacks are voting Democratic, that still numerically isn't really going to translate to Democrats being able to be competitive all over the state. And so we've certainly seen evidence of that. What makes Georgia stand out from its neighboring states like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana is, one, the racial polarization amongst whites isn't that high in terms of sort of their partisan voting. So there are more white Democrats in the state than there would be in some of the neighboring states. And also, we have a higher population of other voters of color, Hispanic, Asian American voters. And these groups, though not as Democratic as African Americans, still break more Democratic than Republican in their voting behavior. And so under the right circumstances, when you have a large enough population and when you have a really strong candidate and a compromised Republican candidate, it's possible for Democrats to be able to win elections, as we saw in 2020 in the presidential election, and also in the Senate races in the 2020 cycle, and in 2022 in the U.S. Senate race.
But Andra, do you, as far as a turnout, and are you hearing anecdotally, or are you seeing results from the past 2 years on minority voting turnout? Is there a malaise? Is there, as you talked about, or someone talked about, not a lot of excitement with the candidates? What do you hear along those fronts?
So I think the big issue there's a lot in the news right now about whether or not Black voters are shifting and defecting to go vote for Donald Trump, and particularly Black men. And so there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One, don't pay attention, but take with a grain of salt polls that are coming this far in advance of an election. There's going to be a change and there's going to be a shift as we get closer to the election. Also, don't pay as much attention to polls where the survey sample is from registered voters as it is from likely voters, because there's a difference between registered and likely voters. Their behavior looks a little bit different. Other things to keep in mind: Black men have always been but for a long time have been less Democratic than Black women. So I could look at data with the exception of 2008 that goes back to the 1970s, and I can show you that there's a gender gap. The gender gap's bigger now than it was, say, in the 1970s, but Black women have tended to be more Democratic than their Black male counterparts. So lots of things that people are talking about are things that have kind of always been there. We're just paying a whole lot of attention to now. And the final thing that I would say about surveys is, this is not to say that Donald Trump might not do better amongst Black voters nationally in the 2024 cycle. But we're saying a lot about shifting on survey sample sizes that are actually relatively small, that have huge margins of error. And then you're comparing surveys across one another, which means that the confidence intervals get bigger when you're actually doing comparisons across surveys. So I just take all of it with a grain of salt. Now, that doesn't mean that Democrats can kind of rest on their laurels and assume that everything is going to happen the way that it normally does, because even if under regular circumstances, 90% of the Black vote goes for Joe Biden in the general election nationally and here in Georgia, if you have lower Black turnout in a state where Democrats are actually still numerically advantaged, that's the difference between winning and losing a state. So Democrats still have the burden and the onus to run a flawless mobilization campaign, and they should still assume that they're the underdog, and they should run like they're underdogs.
Do you see, we saw President Biden down at Morehouse College Give us, did you talk to folks after that about any impact that he had anecdotally on getting people excited? Or is this going to be the first of many trips he'll probably be making to Georgia to try to get the vote out?
Until the polls suggest otherwise, that one of those two major party candidates is comfortably ahead, I would expect that there's going to be a lot of attention to the state. And I expect that President Biden, Vice President Harris, and other Democratic surrogates are going to spend a lot of time in the state making appeals to African-American voters, not taking them for granted, because that's a longstanding critique of how the Democratic Party has treated Black voters. And I think they're going to be continually making the case. So, I don't expect that the Morehouse speech would be a one-off, and I don't think that that speech would be sufficient enough to sort of convince skeptical Black voters that they should get off the couch. But again, I think the threat is more of the couch and people staying home than it is people defecting and voting for Donald Trump, even if we see an increased vote share for Trump ultimately in the 2024 election.
Stacy, I'd like to go back to you and then to Saira also about what issues are resonating with voters. We heard Senator Ossoff talking about the post office. I don't know if you're hearing about the same things, but whether issues, the economy, reproductive rights, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Let's go to Stacy, if you could start off.
Sure. Well, I agree. What Senator Ossoff is hearing is what I'm hearing. We are mostly insular people, and most people draw their box around themselves and their house and their family. And so the post office affects your daily life. The economy, your kids' schools, things like that are always going to be top of mind. Now, the second set of issues is what do we see on TV? And so that leads us to reproductive freedom. It leads us to what's going on in Gaza. With one exception, I will say that reproductive freedom is sort of a mainstay now, because what a sea change we saw with the overturning of Roe, and women are not soon to forget that. And it's going to be front of mind. It's going to be talked about a lot. So certainly that stays there. But at the end of the day, it's the basics. It's jobs, it's the economy, it's education, it's healthcare. Georgia's still one of the states that has refused to expand Medicaid and take that money. So we still have hundreds of thousands of Georgians who are without healthcare coverage. So that's obviously a big deal. We still have hospitals closing. So if you go to South Georgia and these areas that are underserved from a healthcare perspective, that's going to be something that you hear about. But the best way to win elections is to keep it simple, stupid, and focus on what people are focused on, which while people are watching the news and they're hearing those things, they are mostly worried about their house, and that's what they're going to talk about.
Saira, are people just not yet focused on the November elections, and this is just going to build gradually and they're going to come aboard?
What I can tell you is when I was knocking doors during this primary, people are exhausted in anticipation of November. They're already tired because they know the barrage of, communications that's going to be coming their way shortly after the summer ends. And I think they're, just getting ready for that. But I do have a lot of hope that people will come around. I think nothing insults Georgians, Southerners more than attempts to suppress their vote. And what we have seen in Georgia since 2020 is exactly that. The legislature has passed several election overhaul bills that are meant to make voting harder in Georgia since the 2020 Democratic wins in Georgia. And, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're saying that we have secure elections, that you can trust the results of the elections, but then they're also saying that we have to make all these really substantial changes to the laws to ensure election security and integrity and increase confidence in the elections. And so which is it? Do we have secure elections or don't we? Well, we do, but they're using this rhetoric as justification for changing the rules. And because the rules have been changed in 21, in 22, and in 23 again, the onus is on us and groups like Power the Vote to do the hard work of just constant communication with voters and educating them and re-educating to the ever-evolving laws surrounding our elections in Georgia. And it is as much as I absolutely agree with Representative Evans that, people are insular and they're concerned about the things that are in front of them, but they are also seeing what is happening. They are taking note of this attempt to make voting more difficult in Georgia. That is not lost on Georgians here. And I think at the end of the day, that is going to drive a lot of people to the polls.
Okay. I want to do one more question maybe to all three of you. and that's the news of the day. How were people focused much on the trial? Maybe it varied from district to district to whether they're following it. Talked about news that's on television. Do you see this changing opinions at all? And your own personal reflections on what happened today. It sort of jolted us quickly around 5 o'clock. Go ahead, Saira, you can start. Yeah.
So I think, obviously I'm getting lots of texts from folks who I expect to hear from that are celebrating this and see it as a big change. I think what has been more disappointing for me is seeing on Twitter and other social media, my GOP colleagues in the House, and they have fallen in line very quickly from the Speaker of the House on downward, basically saying that the system is fixed, these institutions are fixed, our judicial system is fixed, the DOJ is weaponized, and that the real verdict is going to come out on in November. So basically giving their voters, Republican voters, a pass on continuing to vote for Trump if that's what they wanted to do in the first place. And so, this is supposedly the party of law and order, but they're very quick to throw out the rule of law, I guess, when it affects their political candidate. And so that, it's not surprising, but we see people falling in line very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Stacy, let's go to you for that.
Yeah, and Saira brings up a great point because I have conflicting feelings in my mind. I love seeing the justice system work, that no one is above the law, that the jury system works. I mean, think about how hard it is to get 12 people to agree on just where they want to go to dinner or how they would describe the color of a house. You had 12 people agree that he was guilty on 34 different counts. Like, that's the system working. But then you see this erosion in the confidence by people saying, because it's their candidate and it's their guy, oh, it must have been fixed, it must have been rigged. I remember being in I think it was a freshman in high school when the OJ verdict came out, and they had this news crew that came to our classroom, and they were asking us what we thought of the verdict. I think it was a civics class, and I remember saying, it didn't seem right to me, but I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room. Like, why there's no deference or grace or anything toward these people that were sitting there every day listening to every piece of evidence is very frustrating. But as far as impact on the election, I see two things. I see certainly a motivation of the MAGA crowd, of the base, but I think that was already there. I think they already felt like he was this put upon victim because he's even being tried. So I don't think those folks are any more motivated than they already were. I think that this is going to have a huge impact on independent voters. And they told us that in polls a long time ago with the caveat of what a poll means. But they said, we don't want a president who's been convicted of a felony. I mean, whether he goes to jail or not, he is now a convicted felon. It's never happened in the history of our country. And you cannot underestimate sort of the ick factor of that when independent voters are going to the polls. So I think overall it'll be a positive impact for Democrats in November. But I hate the continued erosion of our institutions that our folks in leadership are allowing to happen day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. And Andra, you probably have a somewhat different view. I'd like to ask you about the view of the political science department at Emory University and your colleagues. Has this been a topic of conversation, and did you get any immediate reaction after the verdict today?
Oh, I can't speak for my colleagues. And so I typically don't. So I can only speak for myself, and I see my analyst role in venues like this as being nonpartisan and to be objective. So I'll refrain from talking about what I personally think about this particular case. I will note the historic nature of it. And I think people have to sit and wrestle with, what does it mean when the Republican Party nominee is a convicted felon? Or what does it mean that a former US president for the first time in history has been convicted of felonies? And so I think people have to make their own decision about how comfortable they are with that and then proceed accordingly. How I think this is going to play out in the national space is quite simple. I think most people's opinions were already baked in long before this trial started. And so I don't think that this particular verdict is going to change much, at least in the short term. I, like Representative Evans, am going to be paying attention to survey data now that this isn't a hypothetical situation, but that it's real, to see if we see any movement. But I'm personally prepared for there not to be any movement. Last week, PBS NewsHour, NPR, and Marist released a poll where they asked, like, what will happen if Trump is convicted of a crime? 2/3 of the respondents said it's not going to change anything. I think reflected this idea that a lot of this idea is baked in. We saw some doubling down amongst partisans. So Republicans were more likely to say this is going to make me more likely to vote for him, and Democrats were more likely to say this is going to make me less likely to vote for him. And it was independents who were like, this isn't going to change my mind, suggesting that this isn't what they cared about. And I think in particular, because this contest or this particular trial was about the case that was salacious, but in terms of national security and kind of, threats to democracy seemed to be the least serious. And I'm not saying that it was the least serious, but I'm just saying sort of relative to the other charges, this seemed like the one that didn't matter as much. I think that there is the basis for people to discount it heavily or to rationalize a decision to continue to do whatever it was that they felt like doing. So, I'm willing to be disproved by the data. If, we get new polling data next week that shows a shift, I will concede the point. But, this isn't going to negate the need for both parties to run the drill. And I think what we're going to see is how effective are both campaigns in building a mobilization infrastructure to make sure that they get their partisans out to vote. And whichever one does the best job of that is going to be the one that wins.
Okay, thank you. I think many of us here can remember when election season used to start after Labor Day. It's been going on for more than a year now, but it really kicked off after Memorial Day today. So thank you all for joining us tonight and for your input. And let's go to Ed Cohen for some closing thoughts. Ed.
Jim, thanks so much. And thanks so much to our speakers. Georgia is certainly one of the most interesting places to watch an election because there's so many moving parts. And I appreciate the job that our panelists did today, putting some focus on that. The topic that we were just talking about is it's hard to tell whether it's going to be significant or not. This is going to be an election like no other. We know what we know. There's so much that we don't know. Indeed, I'm not sure we can even fathom what we don't know, given what's been going on in this election cycle. I mean, whoever would have thought that a presumptive nominee of a major party would be convicted of a felony? In a rational world, that would have ended that campaign for that candidate. But it really does remain to be seen how the voters will respond. And as I think our speakers have pointed out, there's no mystery about that with the Trumpies and the Biden supporters. But what about the middle? And Stacy believes it will be significant. Let's keep in mind that this is a candidate who's been impeached not once, but twice. Let's keep in mind that this is a candidate who has lost not one, but two civil trials. It owes over $90 million. And so the question is, will being convicted a felon be a factor that drives people away? Or is it just that we just become numb to this? And I think that really is the question we need to watch. And while he still leads in the polls in some swing states, we've been cautioned about putting too much credence into what the polls are saying right now. That I think we're not in bad shape. In fact, that's my point. It's a long time between now and November. Things are going to happen that will impact this election, some good, some bad. But we are very much in the game, and the key is going to be to get our voters out. You ask, what is it that I can do as an individual voter? Obviously, you can give money, and I'm going to remind you that this is a fundraiser for Power the Vote, and I ask you to make a contribution to support their good work. But what else can you do? If you have kids and grandkids, talk to them. Tell them that elections matter. If they think there is no difference between the candidates, think again. Reproductive rights, climate change, student debt, and a myriad of other issues. There is a difference. I don't know how many of you were on campuses during the Vietnam War, but I know I was furious at Hubert Humphrey for not coming out against the war. And it almost made me not vote for him. I got smart, and I did. But I hear so many students saying, politics don't matter. I'm not even going to show up. And in fact, that's actually going to be the subject of our next special event. What are young voters thinking? And you'll be receiving details about that program in the next couple weeks. We'll be sending out a link so you can see this program again or send it to friends. In the meantime, please remember to go to our website, partners4democracy.org, contribute to Power the Vote, and the other grassroots groups, all of which are dedicated to getting out the vote, so that we can do what we need to do, which is to make sure our people show up at the poll. So again, Jim and our guests, thank you so much, and have a pleasant rest of